Professor, thank you for being here. It's going to be an interesting episode. We're going to talk about games and artificial intelligence, which I don't think is an intersection we've talked about on this program. So I appreciate you, your audience. Um, to start off, what makes a good game? Let's start off at the basic. What makes a good game?
Okay, starting with an easy one, sure. No, I think a good game is a wildly subjective thing to ask about. Different individuals are going to have different perspectives in terms of what that means, and that's also something that's changed over time. So I don't think there's a nice, succinct answer I can give you, unfortunately.
What's a good game to you?
What's a good game to me? I mean, I also think that that's a really broad question. I think a good game to me is one that succeeds at whatever its design goals were in terms of the particular kind of player experience it was looking to elicit in its player base.
And when we're talking about gaming, are you talking about like there's a certain friction with games sometimes, like you have your phone, you have your laptop, sometimes you're in an arcade and stuff. Do all of those mesh in your mind? Or when you think of games, what kind of device are you thinking of?
No, it's all that and more, right? I think that you can play a game on basically anything. And that includes, a board game is a game, a tabletop role-playing game is a game, right? I'm a games maximalist. Other people have tried to define a particular subset of things in a particular way to say, no, just this is a game. And I think that's sort of a fool's errand. It's not worth doing.
And one of the things about games, I think I don't think people think deeply about games just in this way, and unfortunately I do, but what is the kind of nature of a game? Is it escapism or is it entertainment?
I think it's both or neither, depending on who you ask and what kind of games you're playing, right? Uh, Games are just a type of media, right? And so we might as well say, like, well, are films art or entertainment or escapism? Like, all of those exist within the genre or the area of films.
When we're talking about artificial intelligence, how does that intersect into games? Because
Sure.
AI is a tool, but now AI is able to just build games. And we'll get to that because I think there's a lot of nuance there. But where does AI intersect into the gaming industry?
Sure. I mean, so AI has shown up since nearly the beginning of the games industry. Right. So, in the 1979, you had procedural games, things like Rogue, where we get the term roguelike now. Also in the 1970s and early 80s, you had the first instances of like finite state machines in games, right? Games have always been interested in AI because games have always been interested in simulation. And part of that has been an interest in simulating intelligence, right? And having characters that seem like they're alive. Now, because of the technical restrictions of a game, you're generally looking at your game's AI system as getting roughly 10% of the available compute in whatever system you're running on. So they're interested in approaches that allow you to fake intelligence cheaply, right? And that's been the norm forever, basically, for the last like 50 something years. More recently, that has changed as people have gotten into notions of large language models or big transformers, as I prefer to call them. But, the same basic stuff is still used in games and I think won't stop being used in games.
How has the gaming industry changed with the introduction of these big transformers? So, first of all, I should ask, has it changed? And maybe it hasn't changed wholesale, but maybe these, three or four independent sectors have changed in the gaming industry. So that'll be an interesting thing to ask you. But number two is,
Sure.
has it changed again wholesale or has it wrapped around?
Sure. No, I mean, I don't think it's changed wholesale. The largest sort of impact on the games industry so far has been sort of through both concept art being replaced with diffusion models. So these models that can generate you something, an image based on a text prompt, right? There's a bunch of places that now consider a bunch of game studios that now think, why should we pay a human to do this when we can just visualize it ourselves, right? So that's certainly happened in a number of cases. Like very recently, the latest Crazy Taxi, which is this long running series, revealed that they used it entirely for the game's concept art. And then the other place that it has been used quite a bit is in code generation. So these large language model tools for doing code generation, things like GitHub Copilot, Claude, etc. Those are the two big vectors, but generally speaking, it has not been some kind of radical transformation. The same sorts of productions are still in place. And a large number of games don't want to use any kind of quote unquote Gen AI at all, in large part because the audience is very anti Gen AI. And so if they're looking to make a lot of sales, it can often be counterproductive to make use of these approaches.
Oh, there's so much to unpack there. Number one, I want to ask, are games art?
Sure. Yeah, I would say games are art. But that's again because I'm a games maximalist, but I'm also an art maximalist. You could tell me anything is art, and I would say, yeah, sure, that's art. I think that it's just sort of a conversation not worth having.
Okay, or definitely worth having. But number two, I want to ask is, what is the nature of this kind of pushback to Gen AI? Is it because, there's I don't want to monologue for like 5 minutes, but just to give some context, Gen AI makes, generating concept art easier. It makes generating code easier, but easy doesn't mean quality. And so when we're doing that, do you think that using AI in any capacity degrades like the overall soul of the game, if you want to call that?
It's an interesting idea. I mean, if we thought that using diffusion models or large language models corrupted the soul of the game, then we could also say that any game that used, say, Perlin noise to make its landscapes is corrupting the soul of the game, right? So, like Skyrim, for example, which is not a procedural game, it's the same every time, but that landmass is originally a Perlin noise. Or games like Minecraft, right, where it is every different every time you play it, and that's Perlin noise. But in those cases, we could say, well, that still fits the designer's vision and use of these coding tools or these diffusion models to be able to do this concept art stuff is removing the designer vision. There's arguments that you could have had there. That's subjective and it depends on where you're going to draw that line. I think the reason why people have turned against it is more to do with ethical concerns around the technology, less to do with any notion of impacting the soul of the game, right? All of these models have been trained on basically scraping the internet, including the work of concept artists, like prior game concept artists, and now they're taking those same people and basically that they like took advantage of essentially, and now they're out of a job because of it, right? So I think it's much more the ethical and then also the resource concerns that people have around these technologies that's leading to this negative response.
How do you balance being a games maximalist with also having these opinions, not against generative AI, but kind of nuanced towards generative AI? So on the one hand, you want to have the best games possible, but on the other hand, we can't use the cutting edge tools to make those games the best games possible. How do you hold that balance?
I mean, I never said that they can't use those. I was referring to the public audience's notion of like why they would turn against those and why they'd be less likely to purchase a game. So that was not me saying it's like illegal to use these tools by any means.
For sure. Maybe we can take we can put the hat of like an executive who's deciding whether to use generative AI tools or not. Because on the one hand, these models are very powerful at generating tools. On the other hand, maybe for the marketing or maybe for just the public facing game, it's going to cause a little bit of backlash. If someone were listening to that and trying to decide on that balance, what would you say to them?
I mean, I would probably recommend what I always recommend to everyone, which is not use these tools at all. Because right now we are in a massive bubble with artificial intelligence technologies, right? OpenAI is losing $12 billion a quarter, right? And a large part of that is that these technologies are being given to people for free or very cheaply in comparison to their actual cost. And so I don't recommend anyone to become sort of reliant on these tools to be able to do their jobs, because when the cost goes up, they will be paying a large amount of money for that reliance.
So this is, again, a lot of my audience is Gen Z, and
Sure.
they're growing up with this technology.
Sure.
Again, a very small percentage, but a non-trivial percentage are Gen Alpha, and they are growing with this technology. So hearing somebody like you say, don't use them at all. It's kind of like, saying again to my generation Z, put your phones away. Don't use your iPhone, right? It doesn't make any sense. But
Sure.
there's a lot of value in that. If we can just double tap into this and just get a deeper perspective,
Sure.
is there something else going on, like regardless of the technology, about Gen AI for humans? Like, is it causing? Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, so, there's cognitive debt for sure. There's been a number of findings of that, of repeatedly using the technologies, becoming reliant on these technologies means that you are less sort of able to do the tasks that you are using those technologies for. That's certainly true. But again, it really does come down to the cost. So, for example, GitHub Copilot just moved from a monthly model where you could pay them like a flat $30 or $50 USD rate to a token-based model, right? Where you're now actually having to pay for each of the tokens that you're using at not even the actual cost, but something closer to approximating the actual cost of using these. People then went from, again, that 30 or 50 USD per month to 30,000 USD per month in terms of costs. So when I'd say I don't want people to become reliant on these tools, it's for that reason, right? In maybe 2 years, all of the sort of free money around AI that is making these tools free is going to disappear. And that means that people are going to have to pay their actual costs. Now, it's possible in the future that there will be tools that will have similar performance, but will be much cheaper to use. That's possible. But they aren't here right now, and they aren't these tools. So I don't recommend becoming reliant on these tools.
What do you suppose is going to happen? Because it doesn't seem like there's something where we're just going to completely go back to the way things were. And
Sure.
it also doesn't seem like businesses are going to be too happy with, spending all this money on integrating AI and all this productivity and all of this, and then say, you know what, we were wrong. Let's just get rid of all of this. I don't subscribe to like the great financial 17 times the great financial crisis thing, or even 4 to 5 times. I'm also not a doomer. I'm not going to say that, the market's going to tank and we're all going to be in a depression for 50 years. But from somebody like you who has a more nuanced and realistic perspective, what do you suggest people prepare for? Like, we can talk about that. And then I also want to tack on, what does somebody in Gen Z or Gen Alpha, what do they study? What do they do in order to move away from it, knowing this now?
Sure. Okay, so what is going to happen? I mean, to a large extent, this is not known, obviously. I can speculate a little bit. As I said, I expect within the next 2, maybe 3 years, we're going to get a AI bubble crash, right? A pop of these things. That's primarily going to impact OpenAI and Anthropic, who I just suspect won't exist in a few more years. Like, these just are companies that will not exist anymore. They might be sold off for parts. They might exist in name, but functionally, they're not going to exist because neither of these companies actually makes any money. They are wildly, wildly in the red. And unfortunately, at some point, a company has to make money. So I think that's going to go away. I think that a bunch of the big tech players that have other businesses that can sort of prop up their AI side, right? So like Google has search, Microsoft has, its various different, has, hands in a million pies, et cetera. They're probably going to keep going, and there will be new players who show up, right? In terms of what's going to happen with technology, so part of the issue here is the scale that we have right now, or the sort of performance of the models we have right now, is primarily due to using a bunch of tokens. So we're running these models in an incredibly expensive way, right? And that's leading to this decent performance, right? They can do a decent job on a number of tasks. A number of people have described it as like a talented undergrad, right? In sort of what they're capable of doing. But that's incredibly expensive. Again, like $30,000 per month per user, something like that. Like, it's just not feasible. So a few different things can happen depending on whether people can crack the thing they're trying to crack, which is making this a lot cheaper. If they can make this a lot cheaper, which I have doubts about, but we'll see similar kinds of tools, but they'll just be offered by other people, right? Because Anthropic and OpenAI won't exist. If they can't do that, then what we're going to be left with is smaller models that can run on individual consumer hardware. Because the big expense is like these AI data centers you might have heard of, right? Where you're having to host these models and, act as a server for a bunch of people to talk to. If instead you can offload that compute requirement onto the person's own computer, right, or phone or PC or whatever, then you don't have to pay that, right? And as a business, that starts actually making more sense. So we'd be looking at smaller models running locally. So that's going to be worse performance. And they're only going to be good at sort of giving you like templated boilerplate. The hallucinations are going to be a lot worse. There will be use cases for those models, but they're not going to be the same use cases people have now, right? They're not going to be doing people's homework, right? They're not going to be like, generating whole code projects perfectly, well, perfectly in quotation marks, et cetera. So that's the sort of scale of that. And then there will be, cutting edge stuff where people will still be pushing these things to see how far you can get them with the hopes that they can get them to the point where they're like, a world expert in quality. Because if they can do that, then they feel like, well, then 30,000 a month for a world expert, that's completely reasonable, right?
How does the nature of your job and your research change as this is happening? Are you is there something that you're doing with not just your career but your research to make it more anti-fragile to this? Does it get affected?
No, my research basically doesn't get touched by this at all. So I do a bunch of stuff with games, and I do a bunch of stuff with like the medical domain. In both of those cases, we have very little data, and that data is highly specialized to the particular thing that we're interested in. So we can't just apply a large language model. There's not like some massive data set we can go scrape. It's basically entirely orthogonal to what I'm doing.
I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek and facetiously, but you can't just generate synthetic data?
No, unfortunately not. Synthetic data would have to do with like, it would just replicate humans' expected biases in the data as opposed to like what's actually there, right? So if we're trying to learn about something like, for example, one of the projects I'm working with Dr. David Olson here at the University of Alberta is on preterm birth. And we just don't know what are the factors that causes certain kinds of preterm births. And so if we generate a bunch of synthetic data, it would just be like whatever biases and sort of like guesses people have had so far. It wouldn't actually have ground truth associated with it.
AI is looking to just fade into obscurity, not according to you, but just in the same way as like the metaverse, for example. Everybody was excited about it for a month, and then we don't really talk about it, or we talk about it as like a case of something fading into obscurity. We're just not going to see this as this incredible innovation towards AGI that we're seeing it as right now in 10 years.
Sure. I mean, it's definitely not going to get us to AGI, that's for sure. But it's not like it's going to go away. So I think one of the big problems here is that people don't have any real sense of history in terms of what is artificial intelligence, right? They think that artificial intelligence started in 2023 or something, right? But we've had multiple what we call AI summers previously. It's just basically times when everybody was excited about AI and there's a lot of funding about AI, right? And a bunch of the AI approaches that it showed up during the last summer are still used by people to this day. If you use any kind of maps application, and that's like telling you a route to get from one location to another, that's using a kind of artificial intelligence approach called search or planning. And that's still used by, I would say the majority of people with a phone, right? That's massively impacted people's lives in terms of like, okay, I can get somewhere without having to like figure out how to get there on a map or like automatically tell me where traffic is good or bad, right? Things like this, advances in medical search and medical technologies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like that's not going to go away. It's just not going to look like a bunch of companies telling you, yes, we're going to solve intelligence or anything like that.
I'm just going to move away from AI and just focus on games for a second, because this is something that I enjoy thinking about, but I kind of get weirded out about. And I'll tell you the nature of my being weirded out about. I feel like from my generation, we're going to look at games as not just entertainment, but escapism. And as we create like more frictionless entry points, like, the not the Meta glasses, but like let's say the Apple Vision Pros, they get easier to use, they get more fun to use, better battery life, et cetera, that we're going to stay in the game world, so to speak. Do you have these similar, not fears, but like, are you thinking along similar lines? Do you have these similar concerns, or do you just never see games as like this pure escapism thing?
I mean, it's definitely the case that people will use games as escapism, particularly when the world gets worse around them. No, I don't have the same worries that you just expressed, in part because VR and AR are they have similar issues, let's say, to like Gen AI in terms of actual adoption and use and cost in a way that I just don't see that being an issue. What I'm more concerned with in terms of escapism would be things like, the way that Roblox can just capture kids. And all they want to do then is play Roblox. And then Roblox has a number of issues in terms of harms that can come to kids there, right? The game creation economy in there is incredibly exploitative in terms of using child labor. There's all kinds of issues of like grooming happening on Roblox, right? And so that's sort of more of a concern of kids getting locked in one of these sorts of spaces and then being taken advantage of. But no, I don't have a concern about like, I don't think we're in a Ready Player One situation or something like that where people are just going to escape to games and not pay attention to reality.
Okay, you brought up two things, two directions I want to go in. I'm going to try to make sure that they both come back to each other. Why is the AR VR technology similar to Gen AI in terms of like the costs and the this incredible vision, but it doesn't actually correspond to reality? I've never heard that before. I would love to double click on that.
Sure. So, similarly to these various Gen AI models and services, VR and AR hardware is wildly boosted by sort of venture capital in all of its different iterations, right? Roughly every 5 to 10 years, we make another attempt to say, let's try for VR and AR again. And we just can't get enough adoption from the public, right? So that's a big problem. The other problem is similarly to these Gen AI models, they just don't work with a bunch of people. So in the Gen AI side, for the metaphor on that side, the process of using these tools just doesn't work with somebody's creative process, right? It just doesn't fit in. They don't help. On the other side, for the VR and AR side, a large portion of the population, and this is not anything that can be solved with just a clever engineering hack, will get sick from using VR and AR stuff. This isn't talked about a lot, but a good percentage of the population will get sick looking at any 3D video game. And it's a similar thing happening here, right? We're roughly talking about 10% of the population that just can't do it, just doesn't matter. And it's the case that VR and AR has this other issue, which is that people are used to playing games and sitting down like at a desk with a screen in front of them and playing for like hours. But for VR and AR, you need to be physically moving, and that's much, much more tiring, right? At best, we're talking about bursts of 15, 20, 30 minutes, something like that for most people. Like for most people, you'd have to be like a marathon runner if you really wanted to be playing for hours long sessions. And that's just not stamina that most people have. So it just doesn't work in terms of like how people actually interact with games.
I have a meta question now, and I feel like there's a really simple answer, but I still want to ask it. This, like your last 3 or 4 minutes, I've never heard of. Probably because I'm not in your shoes. I'm not in the depths researching this. But there's also, I think, this kind of like romanticism with technology right now where we just look at what it could be and expect that that's what it is.
Sure.
Why do you think that like reality exists? Because this is a really fascinating thing of like 10% of people literally just cannot use AR, VR. Like that's fundamental to, let's say, their physiology, right? But that's never talked about. Like I struggle to actually formulate the question because I'm just shocked. But if you understand where I'm going, there's this like again this romanticism that I don't understand now.
Sure, I mean this romanticism has always been there, but I think in large part, you can go back for as long as there's been people writing about technology. There's been romanticism about what this will be able to do. But I think a large part of that is because how do you actually hear about these technologies? You hear about them from marketing teams, right? either directly or indirectly, right? But people aren't sort of naturally, where are their ideas about VR and AR coming from? They're coming from these marketing arms. And of course, these marketing arms are like, not going to be like, and of course, as we all know, we have a set market cap that we can't reach beyond this. And of course, most people won't be able to play these games for very long, et cetera, right? They're not going to talk to you about the negatives. That doesn't benefit them.
Right, right. Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you for that. I'm going to have to do a lot more research on this and talk to more folks like you, because this is just, that's really interesting. You talked about children and being exploited on these games. So, not just Roblox, but like Club Penguin. I was like the 9 or 10-year-old. It's gonna be embarrassing, but I was playing Moshi Monsters, and I was like right about to get groomed when my brother walked in and saw what was happening, and he's like, "Get the F off of this." And I was like, "What happened? I'm just sharing my address." And he's like, "No, don't be silly." He was, he used much more meaner words on that, but I understand why.
Sure.
The immediate question that I come into, and I think that a lot of parents are going towards this, is, should games be regulated? Like, should children not be able to play games until they're 12, 15, 18? And yeah, I'll just ask that for now.
Sure. I mean, I think this is a very related question to the sort of social media children's bans that we've been seeing increasingly in the Western world. Speaking of like marketing, I think it's worth just saying really quickly that a lot of that narrative is actually being pushed by the tech companies themselves. So social media companies want to make these laws. Games companies would love, in many cases, to make these laws, but it's slightly different there, which I'll get to in a second, to just say, oh, children can't play these games, right? Because what that means is the company is no longer responsible for moderating the game or the social media platform. Because it's very possible we could totally have children using social media and it'd be perfectly fine. But the problem is moderation. And the moderation would be incredibly expensive to do at scale to fully protect children, right? And that's the reason why these companies are pushing to say, like, well, let's just say we don't just have children here. Now, in practice, of course, they will have children here because there's no way to actually formally age verify fully what's happening, right? In terms of game side, it's a little bit different because games, obviously, a large portion of the game playing public are children, right? And so because of that, they would never be the case that most game companies would push to say, like, well, now we're just going to make it illegal for, a child to play these games. But we already have like ESRB, right, which is the Electronic something Safety Ratings Bureau, something like that, which is all about the same thing, right? It's about saying, okay, we're going to put on the box, this is T for teen. And now we can just say it's not the case that any child will play this game. Now, of course, a child will play the game because children will find a way to play the game. But we can pretend no child will ever have to play the game so they don't have to worry about it, right? It's a very similar thing. So I don't think, to actually answer your question, that we should ban children from games. I also don't think we should ban children from social media. I think they can be very productive and positive things in a child's life, right? If a child is in an abusive situation, or let's say the child is, queer in some way and they're being raised by homophobic parents, being able to connect with other people who are like them is incredibly important in terms of like that child's longevity, right? Surviving long enough into adulthood. The problem is that this would be a lot of work. And I think what actually I would recommend for governments is to, again, be putting the onus on the company in terms of saying, no, it is your responsibility. If this child is groomed on your platform, if this child, is taken advantage of in these other ways on your platform, that's your responsibility as the company who's providing this platform, is providing this service, because they're the ones with the actual resources to make sure that doesn't happen. It's just be expensive to them so they don't want to.
We can probably funnel a lot of the money they're spending on AI into like platform moderation, so to speak. I'm probably going to ask you not an inappropriate question, but just like just a question because I'm curious. Do you have recommendations on how to parent children with technology, how to talk to them about it, how to explain to them, whether they're 6 or 10 or 15, how do you talk to your children on, hey, this is again, really powerful. And I want you to have this. I want you to be able to utilize this. But at the
Hmm.
same time, there are a lot of detriments, a lot of consequences to not utilizing it properly. How do we have that conversation?
It is tough. I don't have kids of my own, but I certainly have friends who are raising children right now. And there's a bunch of good literature out there in terms of, particular ages at which you shouldn't introduce screens before, right? In terms of not impacting cognitive development. And then when you do, making sure you've limited that screen time, right? Because children are naturally, they're looking for as much sort of input as possible, as much sort of like output learning as possible. And the screen is going to give you a lot of information, really high density, right? So they're really wired to pay attention to those things. So they can be really negative if they're let to use them outside of their control. Once a child is old enough to reason through, right? I mean, I think you should treat a child like a small adult, which is what they are in many ways, right? You should talk to them honestly about like, hey, I have these concerns about this. This is why I think you shouldn't be doing this. And you should try to make clear to them why you have these concerns and why you think that they should be paying attention, right? Treating the child with respect as a person with autonomy. Of course, there's going to be points where maybe the child, will want to do something that is not in their best interest, like play Roblox for 12 hours a day or something like that. And you might need to, take it and, act in their best interest. But generally speaking, I think talking to them like you would in any other person with respect, respecting their autonomy, trying to explain to them why you have these concerns. I think that's the general best approach.
My girlfriend's little sister is 6 and cannot live without a screen. Genuinely. She needs a screen at the dinner table. She needs a screen when she's sitting in her mom's lap. She needs 2 screens, one that she's actually using and one in the background. That's the state right now, and this has gone on since she was like 3 or 4. We'll put the parenting question aside, but
Sure.
just as maybe a little bit of hope or a little bit of realism, is there a proper way to get the child away from that? Is it a cold turkey approach? Is it removing one screen at a time? Is it something else?
Sure. I'm not an expert on what we might call addiction or addictive behaviors. So I can't speak to this with any kind of great expertise. When you're at that stage, I do think that trying to minimize the use, minimize the dependency is probably in the child's best interest. Um, the last time I looked in this in terms of how to deal with addictive behaviors was a cold turkey approach, but with the understanding that like mistakes will happen and that you have to just sort of be accepting of that. Like there will be occasions where you do break if you're trying to cold turkey approach or something like that. Now, notably, that is when the individual is trying it, not when it is being enforced from on high. So I could easily imagine that weaning somebody off it when they're not the one in control and they're not, the one recognizing the issue here could be useful. In this case, I think trying to convince the child actually that screens are not the best, trying to direct them off of that in terms of like, let's find activities in the real world that don't have a screen in them. Like, let's get you interested in a sport or like, climbing or running or going into the woods or going to the beach or whatever, right? These sorts of things where you don't need the screen, right? And using those as replacement activities could be really really positive. I will say, at least from a cognitive perspective, children are very plastic. So by which I mean like their brains are they're very flexible from an early age. And so even if, they're wildly addicted to screens right now, if you can get them off screens, there's nothing to say that they can't bounce back and, have a perfectly normal sort of outlook.
Wonderful. No, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. And as a last question before we wrap up, are you a technology maximalist? You're a games maximalist, an art maximalist.
Sure.
What's your stance on technology?
Sure. So by maximalist, to be clear here, maximalist just means that I accept anything as the thing, right? So games, I accept anything as a game. Art, I accept anything as an art. So the answer is yes, I do accept anything as a technology, because I always finds it funny to tell students for the first time that like the written word is a technology, right? Or spoken language is a technology, right? These are tools that we are using, that we have developed as humans. And as humans, we are tool users, right?
If you had some advice to, people that are just graduating high school or college that are confused about where to go, not just for career, but how to structure their lives. I don't want to just like make this like about artificial intelligence or even technology, but just how to be human in this day and age. What pieces of advice would you give them?
I work with a bunch of students. I have a number of research students working with me, including a bunch of undergrads, and they have similar sort of questions in terms of like how to be a person, basically. I think the most important thing is to first find the things that you love, right? Whether that be a particular job, particular place, particular people, whatever that is, right? And in terms of how do you find those people or those things or those place or those jobs, your best bet is just experiencing a lot of things, right? So open yourself up, see a bunch of stuff. And then once you find the things that you love, pursue those things, right? So if that's a job that you love, right, pursue doing that job, right? It might mean that to be able to do that job effectively, you have to be the best in the world. Then try to be the best in the world at that, right? Pursue that person, pursue that place, whatever it is, right? I think that's maybe the best way to live as a person.
As a last question, what gives you hope in the world?
What gives me hope in the world? I think the thing that gives me hope in the world is that people have always been people. If we look back, it always feels like, oh my God, it's the apocalypse. But guess what? People forever have always felt like they're in the apocalypse, right? You can go back for as long as you want, and people were like, the end of the world has to be tomorrow, basically. There's nothing else that it could possibly mean. And they were always wrong. And so there's no indicator to me, a bunch of people can be all doom and gloom about a variety of things, about the climate, about AI, about war, et cetera, et cetera. But we as humans keep going. And so I think that's hugely inspiring. And I think that we should keep on acting like we're going to keep going and do the best that we can.
Professor, thank you so much for being here. Where can we keep up with your blogs, your work, etc.?
Sure. So I'm on Blue Sky, Matthew Guzdial there. I do technically have a blog, but it has one post on it, so that's not very useful to you. If you're particularly interested in the research that I do, I do publish those, and there's publicly available. You can find those through Google Scholar. Again, just my name, Matthew Guzdial, will get you there. Every couple of weeks, I'm on CBC's Daybreak Alberta, so if you want to hear me talking about AI stuff, you can follow that. And yeah, I think that's about it. You can always email me as well. I'm very emailable.
I love it. And yeah, exactly. That's how we got you on the program. One kind of like final small question. Are you ever going to develop your own game?
I have, right? So I was an indie dev for a bit. I worked at Zynga. I worked at EA Sports, right? I certainly might make larger games again. For now, I basically make like one small game a year, something like that. Mostly for me. But yeah, sure. I'm always thinking about like, oh, if I was gonna, dedicate years of my life to a bigger game again, what would that look like?
Right. All right. So when Cyberpunk 2077 Part 2 comes out, we'll definitely have you back on the program. Professor, Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.